Imagine an ancient story so controversial and hidden that it lay buried for nearly 1,700 years, where the familiar heroes of the Christian faith, the disciples of Jesus, are instead cast as misguided figures, while Judas, the one branded as a traitor, emerges as a true confidant to Jesus. This is the shocking perspective presented by the Gospel of Judas, an ancient text that paints a completely different picture of Jesus' disciples, their beliefs, and their connection to God. According to this forbidden gospel, the disciples were not aligned with divine truth, but instead were unknowingly following a darker force. It suggests that they worshipped a false god, Yaldabaoth, also known as the demiurge in Gnostic teachings, who is depicted as a lesser, misleading figure that created the physical world as a prison for souls. Judas, rather than being the villain in the story, is portrayed as the only one with true understanding, the one Jesus trusted enough to share profound, secret knowledge about humanity, the universe, and the hidden divine reality. In this account, Jesus reveals to Judas that his own disciples are leading people away from true enlightenment. The Gospel of Judas suggests that the world's rulers are not heavenly beings but dark forces, illusions crafted to trap human souls in ignorance. The portrayal of the disciples as misled and spiritually blinded was a daring challenge to the early Christian narrative, casting doubt on their teachings and, by extension, questioning the authority of the church built upon them. During the early Christian era, various groups interpreted Jesus' life and teachings in very different ways. Among these groups, the Gnostics held a unique view. They believed that spiritual liberation was attained not through ritual or obedience, but through gnosis or hidden knowledge. This knowledge included understanding that a false god had created the material world as a prison, and that the path to true freedom lay in awakening to our own inner divinity and the divine spark within each individual. This gospel goes a step further, claiming that Jesus shared these hidden truths only with Judas, his most trusted disciple. Judas in this story is a hero, the only one with the courage and insight to assist Jesus in freeing souls from the false god's grasp. But why would this gospel depict Judas in such a radically different light? Control and influence were major points of contention during the formation of the early Christian church. By the 2nd century, the early church was working hard to establish itself as the definitive authority on Jesus' teachings. To strengthen their position, church leaders declared some writings to be sacred while discarding others, a process that led to many texts being destroyed or suppressed, including the Gospel of Judas. This gospel threatened the church's foundation, suggesting that the disciples' teachings were based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Jesus' mission. This narrative disrupts the traditional view of Judas as a backstabbing betrayer and instead portrays him as the enlightened disciple who was trusted with profound, mystical insights. Judas' betrayal, according to this text, was not a selfish act, but a crucial part of Jesus' divine plan. Jesus shared his cosmic mission with Judas, revealing that his role on earth was to liberate souls from the false god's illusionary control. Judas' act of betrayal sets in motion the events that would lead to Jesus' crucifixion, not as a defeat, but as a victory, allowing Jesus to transcend the physical realm and return to the divine source. This gospel likely originated within a Gnostic community, a sect of early Christianity that held unique beliefs about God, the material world, and salvation. Gnostics believed that salvation came not from adherence to church doctrine, but from inner awakening to divine truths. To them, Judas' betrayal was not treason, but a fulfillment of destiny, a step in the grand plan. Gnostics reasoned that if Jesus was an all-knowing divine being, he would have chosen Judas deliberately, aware of what would happen. The betrayal, then, was not a mistake, but a key element of Jesus' path to liberation. The Gospel of Judas also served as a critique of the institutional church. By questioning the disciples' understanding of Jesus' teachings, this gospel cast doubt on the spiritual authority of the early church leaders, who claimed to be successors of the apostles. According to the Gospel of Judas, the disciples were led astray by their worship of the demiurge, a false god of the material world, who imprisoned souls in a realm of suffering and ignorance. This critique undermined the foundation of the Church's authority, raising the possibility that its leaders were unknowingly perpetuating a false belief system. In another controversial part of the text, Jesus mocks the disciples' prayers and offerings, suggesting that their worship is misdirected toward the false god, the demiurge, and not the true divine source. This is a strong condemnation of the Church's focus on external rituals, sacrifices, and institutional authority. Instead, the Gospel of Judas advocates for direct, personal enlightenment and the search for inner truth as the path to spiritual freedom. To the Gnostics, authentic spirituality wasn't about following rituals or obeying religious authorities. It was about a transformative personal journey of understanding one's divine origin. For Gnostics, this gospel was a powerful reminder of the need for inner discovery and self-knowledge, qualities they believed were far more meaningful than following any prescribed religious rules. At the time, the Church's teachings often emphasized obedience, submission to authority, and adherence to strict beliefs. But this gospel challenges such dogma, encouraging followers to question the status quo, think critically, and seek truth beyond the visible and material world. In a way, the Gospel of Judas also raises profound questions about the nature of free will. Judas' actions in this gospel seem predestined, part of a divine cosmic plan. His betrayal is portrayed as an essential act in Jesus' path to spiritual transcendence, suggesting that events in the universe are interconnected and that even seemingly negative actions have a place in the divine order. This portrayal of Judas as a hero forces us to reconsider the nature of loyalty, sacrifice, and the complexity of human motives. The Gnostic perspective on Judas' role in Jesus' crucifixion is symbolic of their view of the material world itself. For the Gnostics, the physical world was not a place of divine order, but a prison of illusions created by the demiurge. From this perspective, Jesus' crucifixion was not a tragic ending, but a victorious escape from the constraints of the material world, allowing him to return to the true divine realm. Judas' betrayal thus becomes a moment of liberation, a catalyst that allows Jesus to complete his mission of helping humanity realize their true spiritual potential. This bold interpretation of Judas' role flips the conventional story, recasting him as the only disciple who truly saw Jesus' divine mission and possessed the courage to carry out his part in that cosmic plan. Rather than condemning him, the Gospel of Judas celebrates Judas as a wise and sacrificial figure, embodying the essence of spiritual enlightenment. The Gospel of Judas not only reinterprets Judas' relationship with Jesus, but also calls into question the legitimacy of the early church's rituals and practices. Instead of blindly following religious rules, the Gospel urges readers to look within and find their own path to understanding the divine. This is a direct challenge to the authority of the Church, which sought to control religious beliefs and establish a uniform doctrine. The Gnostic view emphasized personal spiritual experience over institutionalized worship, a stance that was deeply unsettling to the early church leaders trying to establish their influence. At its core, the Gospel of Judas presents a spiritual view that elevates individual enlightenment over religious conformity. The Gnostics viewed rituals and sacrifices as distractions, tools used by the demiurge to keep people enslaved to the material world. In contrast, they believed that true liberation was a deeply personal process, one that required self-reflection, spiritual insight, and an unwavering search for hidden truths. To understand why the Gospel of Judas was so threatening to the Church, it's important to consider the historical context. Around 200 CE, the early Christian Church was working to consolidate its teachings and establish itself as the one true interpretation of Jesus' message. Many early Christian sects, including the Gnostics, held different views, and the Church sought to suppress any belief system that did not align with its doctrines. Texts like the Gospel of Judas, which questioned the disciples' authority and challenged the Church's rituals, posed a direct threat to the institutional power the Church was building. For the early Church, the disciples represented the foundation of Christian authority. The concept of apostolic succession, The idea that the church's leaders were spiritual heirs to the apostles was crucial to its legitimacy. But if, as the Gospel of Judas suggests, the apostles were deceived, this foundation becomes questionable. The text implies that the church's teachings are based on a misunderstanding, a flaw that shakes the very basis of its authority. The Gospel of Judas doesn't only criticize the disciples, it also questions the church's emphasis on obedience and submission to authority. In the Gospel, Jesus encourages Judas to think for himself, to seek knowledge beyond what is taught. This Gnostic emphasis on personal spiritual discovery stood in stark contrast to the early church's message of following established doctrines without question. In this sense, the Gospel of Judas is both a radical reinterpretation of Judas' role and a powerful critique of the early Christian church. It paints Judas not as a betrayer, but as the one disciple who understood Jesus' mission, highlighting the courage required to challenge authority and seek truth. For the Gnostics, true faith wasn't about ritual or obedience. It was about personal enlightenment, an unbreakable connection to the divine, and a willingness to see beyond the surface of reality. This gospel invites readers to see Judas as a spiritual hero, an enlightened disciple willing to sacrifice his own reputation to fulfill Jesus' mission. In doing so, it not only redefines a familiar story, but also encourages us to question the nature of loyalty, sacrifice, and the quest for spiritual freedom. The Gospel of Judas reveals a hidden side of Christian history that has remained suppressed for centuries. It challenges us to rethink everything we thought we knew about the relationship between Jesus, Judas, and the early church. Rather than simply accepting the traditional narrative, the Gospel of Judas opens the door to a deeper, more complex understanding of the spiritual struggles of the time. In this version of the story, Judas is not a villain, but an enlightened figure who, in his own way, fulfills a divine purpose. His actions, often depicted as treacherous, are recast as necessary steps in the cosmic plan that Jesus has laid out. This reinterprets the notion of betrayal, suggesting that true betrayal is not a question of loyalty to a human figure, but a willingness to challenge the false constructs that keep humanity imprisoned in a world of suffering and ignorance. By positioning Judas as the key player in Jesus' ultimate escape from the material world, the Gospel of Judas also sheds light on the nature of salvation in the Gnostic tradition. Unlike the mainstream Christian view, which focuses on Jesus' death as a means to atone for humanity's sins, Gnosticism sees salvation as the liberation of the soul from the constraints of the physical world. The crucifixion, in this context, is not a sacrifice to appease a wrathful God, but an act of transcendence. Jesus' ascension from the false God's creation back to the true divine realm. This cosmic escape is seen as a victory over the demiurge, the architect of suffering and illusion. The Gospel of Judas also challenges the very foundation of Christian theology by rejecting the idea that Jesus' disciples were divinely appointed stewards of God's message. It points out that the disciples, in their blindness, were serving the wrong God. This portrayal would have been dangerously radical in its time, especially as the Orthodox Christian Church sought to solidify its own legitimacy and control. The Church's authority was built on the premise that it was the true spiritual heir to the apostles. But if the apostles were wrong, then the Church's claim to this divine lineage would be undermined. This gospel's stark critique of the Church's rituals and practices is another part of its radical message. In the Gospel of Judas, the external acts of worship, the prayers, sacrifices, and rituals, are shown to be meaningless if they are directed at a false god. This notion, which directly contrasts with the Church's insistence on these practices, serves as a powerful argument for the idea that true spirituality transcends external observance and must be rooted in personal, direct knowledge of the divine. Through the lens of the Gospel of Judas, we are invited to reconsider the very nature of faith. Instead of viewing faith as blind submission to religious authority, it is presented as an active, critical pursuit of truth, a path that requires personal discovery and inner wisdom. Judas, in this light, is not someone who simply accepts the teachings of Jesus, but someone who seeks deeper understanding, who is willing to follow a spiritual path that others might see as unorthodox or even heretical. The suppression of this gospel by the early church is not surprising when viewed in this context. By exposing the fallibility of the disciples and questioning the core of Christian dogma, the Gospel of Judas represents a challenge to the church's monopoly on spiritual truth. It asserts that the path to divine knowledge does not lie in institutional authority or orthodoxy, but in personal insight, free from the influence of a controlling religious institution. The Church, in its quest for unity and doctrinal purity, needed to suppress texts like this one that threatened its authority. The very fact that the Gospel of Judas was hidden for so long speaks volumes about the lengths to which the Church went to silence alternative viewpoints. In the early centuries of Christianity, different factions struggled to define the correct interpretation of Jesus' teachings. As the Orthodox Church solidified its hold on power, any texts that challenged its version of events were discarded or destroyed. The Gospel of Judas, which directly challenges the traditional Christian understanding of Judas, Jesus, and the apostles, would have been a dangerous document for church leaders intent on consolidating their control. For modern readers, the rediscovery of the Gospel of Judas offers a glimpse into an alternative vision of early Christianity, one that values personal spiritual insight and inner knowledge over institutional control. It forces us to rethink the role of authority in religious life and challenges us to question the official narratives that have shaped our understanding of history. By examining this gospel, we confront the complexities of religious power, the nature of truth, and the potential for spiritual liberation through knowledge. The Gospel of Judas presents a provocative and daring challenge to the traditional narrative of Jesus' life and the early church's rise to power. It reshapes our understanding of Judas from a figure of betrayal to a symbol of enlightened sacrifice, offering a new perspective on the struggle between truth and control. It encourages us to look beyond the surface, to seek deeper knowledge, and to question the foundations upon which our beliefs have been built. In doing so, it opens the door to a richer, more complex understanding of the spiritual journey, one that transcends dogma and embraces the pursuit of truth, wherever it may lead.